welcome to Talks at Google today. Before we start, just a reminder, if you're watching live, please add your questions into the chat and we will come to them later. Our guest today is Roma Agrawal, who is a structural engineer, presenter, and author. She studied in London and Oxford and has worked as an engineer on the design of the Shard, Western Europe's tallest tower and visible pretty much everywhere, from everywhere here in London. She also worked on many other buildings, of course, buildings, bridges, and sculptures. Apart from this, she has also spoken to thousands of people at universities and for TEDx. She presented on the BBC and other channels, and you might know her from her first books, Built and How Was That Built? She has also won many awards, too many to list here, and was appointed an MBE for services to engineering. Today we'll be talking about her new book, Nuts and Bolts, 7 Small Inventions That Changed the World in a Big Way. So thank you very much for joining us today, and welcome to Talks at Google, Roma Agrawal.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining. So let's start at the beginning of the book. You start the book with a story about how you cracked open your chalk and pencils as a young child to understand how they function. Can you give us a bit of background on, because there's quite a gap from there to actually becoming a full-fledged engineer. So how was your journey from there to becoming an engineer?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So that is one of my early memories. I used to live in the US and I had one of those like 1980s lunch boxes with like the Muppets on the front. And it was just full of crayons. And I think one day I decided I must have been 4, 5 or 6 years old, something like that. And I wanted to discover what was inside the crayons. And I think all children have this really innate sense of curiosity about the world around them and how things work. And exploring that sometimes involves destruction. And so I was definitely one of the kids that I used to break my crayons and try and look and say, oh, you know, what's inside this? And I have to say I was a little bit disappointed. But then once I started dismantling maybe slightly more interesting things like ballpoint pens, for example, then I thought, oh yeah, there's some more interesting things there. I moved from the US to India when I was about 6 and spent 10 years there. And you know, the emphasis on STEM education, so science, maths, and so on in India is quite high. I always loved science and maths, moved to the UK and did my high school or A-levels in physics and maths, and then ended up doing a degree in physics, because this is one of the really interesting things is, even though I actually kind of knew some engineers, including my dad, I never really considered engineering to be a degree or a career that I could follow. So I ended up doing physics first, and then later realizing that, oh, you know, engineers use physics to solve problems and make real stuff. That's what I want to do. And so I ended up doing a master's in structural engineering, and then getting my first job, which was back in 2005, so a long time ago now.
Yeah, coming to the book, you structured the book into 7 chapters about inventions or classes of inventions. For example, the nail and other fasteners, the wheel, springs, and so on. How did you boil down the world of engineering to these 7 very fundamental inventions?
Yeah, so my first 2 books that you mentioned, Built, which is aimed at adults, and How Was That Built, which is the children's picture book, are about big stuff and about more, you know, things that are familiar to my bit of engineering. So they're about skyscrapers, bridges, tunnels, you know, all of these big pieces of infrastructure. And I spent about 6 years of my career working on the design of the Shard, and that included a lot of the steel structure within the building, including the very top of the tower, which is called the spire, and the viewing galleries within that area. And I spent a very, very long time looking at the nuts and bolts, literally, of the spire. And so after I wrote those books about big things, and then, you know, the COVID pandemic started to hit, lockdowns and so on, and it felt like life became very inward looking and small, I thought, oh, why don't I kind of explore that side of engineering instead? And I basically started making a list of all the things that I thought were elements or components of a piece of engineering. So whether that was, I don't know, a television or a blender or a ballpoint pen or a skyscraper. And then I kept asking myself, but what's more fundamental than the nut and bolt? And what's more fundamental than the screw? And what's more fundamental than a rivet? And I got to nail. And so I kept trying to bring down to the most fundamental level and came up with that list of 7 objects. And so the 7 are nail, wheel, spring, lens magnet, string, I think, which is the most surprising one for me, and pump.
You mentioned the string as a surprising one. For me personally, the magnet was the most surprising one, because it's kind of not an invention because it occurs naturally, but obviously what we make of it then is a lot of engineering history and a lot of what we turn it into.
No, exactly. So string also kind of exists in nature if you think about, like, silk, for example, or spiders' webs and so on. But absolutely, it's what humans did with it or changed and so on. And actually, the naturally occurring magnets, which we know as lodestone, were discovered thousands of years ago. And the Greeks kind of used it, but it was really the Chinese navigators that were the first to use it as a practical object. So they essentially invented the compass and used it to navigate across the deserts and also out at sea. And we didn't really understand the science behind magnetism. Even though we were using magnets, we didn't understand the science behind it for thousands of years. And I would say it's only really in the 19th century when we discovered electricity and understood a little bit about electromagnetism that we started to understand magnetism a bit better. But really, it took until the 1930s when physicists were really studying quantum physics, atomic physics, that we understood what actually makes a material magnetic. And once all of those things happened, our ingenuity and innovation in what we can do with magnetism is like massively, massively increased.
Going into another chapter, the first chapter about nails, there's a story about how you make your own nail. Are there many examples of these things where you actually went and like physically did something as research for the book?
I wish I could have done more of that, but sadly, I basically wrote the book throughout the pandemic. So in the little gaps in between when it was possible, then yes, I was out there. I was lucky to visit some ships to look at some of the nails and fasteners they have in shipping. So I was able to go to like a few museums. I went to a watchmaker's studio in my spring chapter, but I've actually got so this is the nail that I forged in the forge sometime in 2020 during the pandemic. And it was really hard work. So what I found really interesting about this is, as a structural engineer, I'm dealing more with these, which are nuts and bolts. And I've got all kinds of, data tables telling me the thread count, how much tension this bolt can take if you pull it apart, how much shear it can take. So if it gets a sideways force like that. So I had a lot of very theoretical knowledge about steel and fasteners, but going into the forge was actually a really sensory experience. You had to visually look at the color of the steel to see whether it was hot enough. And I was told that red hot isn't hot enough. And I had to wait till it became like a very glowy orangey yellow. And then that means that the piece of steel was actually hot enough. And then I had to take this. So this used to be a big cylindrical rod. And then I hammered it on one side. Then I've turned it by 90 degrees, hammered it on the other side. And then you can hear the clanging sound changes as the metal starts to cool down. You can smell the burning of the coke in the furnace. You put this into cold water once you're done, and it's it's like sizzling because all the steam's coming off it, and you pick it up and it's warm. So it was a very, very sensory experience. And what really struck me with all of this is, like, yes, I've got all of this theoretical, technical knowledge about this, but actually playing with the material is a completely different experience. And I mean, I don't care about nails as a, like if I've got nails in my flat, I don't really care. But this one, which I made, is like the most precious thing to me.
Yeah, you also describe in that chapter how people used to burn down their houses to retrieve the nails from them.
Yeah, so this is where I'm really interested in bringing together humanity, society, history, and all of these incredible things with engineering. I think that sometimes we tend to forget that our relationship with these objects is actually really deep, and it goes back thousands and thousands of years. And so, with each chapter, with each object in my book, I'm exploring what its origin story is, where did it come from, who are the people and the humans behind these things. And the story of the nail is so fascinating because there's a story to do with colonialism, which is the one that you briefly touch on, which is that the nails, the materials are expensive and the amount of labor needed to create them is a lot. And so nails are actually a very precious commodity. So the British Empire banned the export of nails to its colonies, which included the United States. But obviously a lot of homes in the United States are made from wood. So in the 16th and 17th century, if a family was moving homes, when they would build their first home and then they would go to a new place and build another home, they would actually burn down their first home and then collect up all the nails, because the wood was not worth anything to them, but the nails were so precious that they wanted to collect up those nails and use those nails in their new home because it was so expensive to find new nails. So it's really fascinating.
Pretty extreme measure. So you mentioned that the chapters are not just about the inventions themselves. They're not just about the nail or the spring. You also talk a lot about what they enable and what we build out of them. For example, in the chapter about springs, you talk a lot about weapons, bows, crossbows, and then guns, which have a surprising number of springs in them. And then pivot to clocks, which also use springs. And obviously all very influential things in history. Are there any rabbit holes that you wanted to go into and did go into, but it ended up then being too much to include in the book?
Oh, I mean, there were so many of those that I've almost forgotten because there were so many. And it was actually one of the biggest challenges for me was to bring focus to each object and really think deeply about what the story is I want to tell about this object. And then I tried to bring some kind of theme into every chapter. So, with the wheel, my theme was why we should reinvent the wheel, because we always hear this expression, don't reinvent the wheel. And my argument is, if we hadn't reinvented the wheel, even today, we would still be able to make very nice pottery, but we wouldn't have any cars or trains or anything because the wheel was actually invented for pottery. And my theme in the spring chapter is about versatility. So that's versatility in the sense of what a spring actually is, the different shapes it can come into, and then the huge range of applications that you can use springs in. And also, of course, subsequently, what the impact of those inventions are. So the spring, I think, is a great example. I start off with weaponry. So I think the first example of springs in human history are the bow and arrow, like the bow of the bow and arrow, because you're basically deforming a stretchy material or an elastic material. You store energy into it, and then you use that energy in a way that you want to. So that's the kind of the principle behind the spring. And I talk about the story of Genghis Khan, who set up one of the biggest empires in history. And one of his very kind of unique weapons was the bow that he used. The Mongolian bow was very well known for being extraordinarily light, having a really quick, far range. And so they could wreak a lot of destruction with this light, small, portable weapon. And of course, we have to think about all the impacts of engineering. Of course, engineering can be a force for good, but it can also be a force for destruction. And I think it's really, really important that we remember that as engineers. I then move on, as you say, talking about clocks and timekeeping. And again, we can see the idea of time as a positive and a negative, I would say. So nowadays, how many of us are like checking our phone or clocks or watches every few minutes? We want to know exactly what time it is, need to go on to the next thing. So it's almost like our whole lives are driven around time. But there was a time and point in history when that just wasn't the case. And people used to have really inaccurate, imprecise timekeeping. And so I thought a lot about kind of the impacts of that. And then at the extreme other end of the scale with springs, I talk about springs that are so big that, you know, they can wrap around my leg. And those are the kinds that are used in structures. So under earthquake-prone buildings, for example, or in concert halls, we actually suspend big structures, or even just like a concert hall within a bigger building with springs, so that it absorbs vibrations and either stops the building from destroying itself in an earthquake, or you can create a beautiful silence in a concert hall.
Yeah, you touch on the subject of responsibility. So especially in the Springs chapter where you talk about guns, what do you think the modern engineer should how should they respond to this responsibility and address it?
You know, it's such a big question, and it's such an interesting question. And I also host a podcast which is called Create the Future. And I have an episode on there which will come out soon about ethical engineering and what that means. And I think as engineers, we need to think about it at many different levels. So there's the level of the corporation. Well, even above that, there's a level of the government and the country and the policy and regulation and so on. And I think at that level, policymakers need to understand what the responsibilities are, what the good and bad things are that can come out of a piece of engineering, really consider it, study it, and understand it. Then, of course, there are the corporations. What are corporations doing? Then there are all the different layers within that. And then, of course, there's the individual, and, you know, what are we comfortable with developing, doing, and so on. And I think all of these things are so intertwined and tied up with each other. But I would definitely urge all engineers to really think about the impact of our work, because it is huge. And it's really important to think about what the good things are that can come out of our work, but also what are the negative things that can come out of the work, and what can we do to try and mitigate those things? Because I think it's inevitable there will be some misuse or whatever of technology, but we need to, I think, just talk about it more. I think that's step one, is just being aware and talking about it more.
Yeah, I suppose it's a very big topic and could have a whole separate discussion about that. But let's come back to your book. So there's a lot about yourself in the book as well. In particular, of course, the chapter about lenses, which starts as a letter to your daughter. Can you talk about a bit which parts of your own history, of your own family's history, you've been able to weave into the book?
Yeah, so I have. Well, I mean, I found it funny, but there's a review somebody left me on Amazon criticizing my book because there was too many personal stories in the book, and that I should only focus on engineering. And for me, the reason I find it funny is because who I am and what's happened in my life and engineering are intrinsically connected. I cannot separate those things. And I think that's true for everybody, even if you don't realize it. So the personal stories that were really very important to me that I brought into the book. One is the lens chapter, as you mentioned. The lens chapter is about the manipulation of light and what we can do as a result of that. And of course, one of those is to see really, really small things. So the reason that I've opened that chapter as a letter to my daughter is because my daughter is an IVF baby. And it is such an incredibly difficult process to go through. There's a lot of taboo around it. People don't really talk about it very openly. I think particularly in the workplace, and particularly in workplaces which are very male-dominated, but men also go through IVF from their own perspective. And I really wanted to kind of bring that conversation a bit more out into the open. And, you know, I'm very aware that it ended well for me and that I have my child, but I know for so many people that's not the case. So it's a really, really delicate, difficult subject for a lot of people. But when I thought about it more, I also thought about what's the engineering behind all of this. And of course, without the lens, without the microscope, my daughter wouldn't exist. And so I chose to start the story of the lens from that perspective. And I found it a really wonderful, actually quite cathartic thing to write about. And I'm really glad that I did this. because it allowed me to also just explore histories that are really, really fascinating. And then the other chapter where I really kind of center my family is the chapter on magnetism. So we've talked a little bit about the magnetism chapter already. But again, if I was thinking about the focus of my magnetism chapter, I was focusing on stuff that can happen at a distance. And that's really about communication. So whether it was the telegram system that my grandfather used in India, which was built by the British colonialists, to the telephone. And my aunt was an immigrant in the US, and she used to have to book a phone call 24 hours in advance to speak to her parents back in India in the 1960s and 70s.
Hard to imagine that today.
I know, right? And then there's the cathode ray television, which, at least for me, I was born in the 80s. That was the kind of television I had when I was growing up. And exactly as you say, our smartphones, where now my daughter just has to swipe a screen and she can talk to my parents in India immediately. Unlike my aunt, who still lives in the US, doesn't take her 24 hours to call India anymore. But I wanted to make it relatable to anyone reading that, oh yeah, there's all of this stuff that would have been experienced by my families, but it's also engineering.
Yeah, I think it definitely makes it a book, like it makes it you a book about engineering as opposed to just a book about engineering. But apart from yourself, you also focus on lots of other engineers and not just the engineering. For example, I remember in the chapter about the wheel, there's a very fascinating story of the invention of the dishwasher by a woman called Josephine Cochran, which I have to admit I have never heard of before reading your book. What drew you to this particular story?
I had never heard of her before I wrote the book myself. And I think that's been the biggest joy for me in this writing process, was discovering these stories that are not very well known. As a woman of color myself, being in a very white male-dominated industry, it is really important to me to bring out some of these stories and to kind of understand what the different barriers are that face all kinds of different people for different reasons. And, the patent system is a really fascinating one, because there are lots of stories of people who have a patent for something, but that doesn't mean they actually invented the thing first. So I'll come back to that in a second. But yeah, Josephine Cochran was the daughter and granddaughter of engineers. And it always strikes me that had she been born Joe rather than Josephine, then maybe she would have, or he would have become an engineer following in the father's footsteps. But that wasn't the case. So she was married at a young age. She began doing, looking after her home and inviting people over for dinner. She had a problem that she got frustrated with, which is that washing dishes took too long and that her precious china was cracking when people were washing the dishes. And so she started the design of the dishwasher from the inside out. So she started actually by designing the cage of the dishwasher, saying this is exactly where each one of my pieces of crockery or my cups or whatever are going to fit in, which is the opposite way basically all the men had been designing the dishwashers. I'm going to guess that there was not many men in that era that washed dishes, and I know that that's changed. But she obviously brought a different perspective to the design of the dishwasher, and she ended up holding the patent for it. And so in a way, her story was a little bit easier to find because she holds a patent in the US, and she was inducted into the National Hall of Fame in 2006. So like a good 100 years after her patents were granted. I also talk a lot about some of the figures from the Islamic golden age of science. So in the West, or definitely in Europe, we talk about the Dark Ages in the medieval period, 1,000 years ago. In fact, that was the most enlightened period in the Middle East, in West Asia, in terms of scientific discovery and innovation. So I found a few different people. So one was called Ibn al-Haytham, and he worked 700 years before Isaac Newton on the study of optics. And I sometimes do this when I'm in a room. I say, how many people have heard of Newton? And every single person puts their hand up. And if you say, how many people have heard of Ibn al-Haytham? And nobody has. But actually, one might argue that his work was just as seminal, if not more, than Isaac Newton's, but because he was Muslim and in a particular era, and then the records got destroyed or didn't come over or whatever happened, his story was lost. So yeah, it's definitely very, very important for me to bring out the stories of the people that normally would not get recognition. And there's quite a few of those in my book.
How did you go about finding these stories? Because you said you also didn't know of Josephine Cochran. So what did you do to find these stories?
Yeah, it's hard, right? It's much easier to find the usual stories because you can search for them online and find all of this information. So a lot of it is going to speak to some of the specialist societies. For example, if you go to like a women engineering society, they often have lists and lists of women that were involved in engineering in some way. And I have read like hundreds of profiles of women and thought, oh, I could feature her in this chapter or her in that chapter. Some of it was, I bought some books about Black inventors, for example, some from Africa, from the United States and so on, and read lots of what are the things that they held their patents in. There are organizations such as 1001 Inventions. They have a really great website and they hold loads of information about the Islamic golden age of science. So again, I sat and looked at the profiles of lots of the scientists and engineers and figured out who kind of works in my books. So it definitely requires more work. Those are not the easy stories to find, but there are now a lot of resources coming to the front, which I think is a brilliant thing. So yeah, hopefully more and more of that will come out now.
Yeah, I have a couple more questions, but just a comment for our viewers. If you have questions, please leave them for us. We will be able to ask them later if you're watching live. If you're not watching live, can't do that, unfortunately. Yeah, you mentioned it. Why is it that even in 2023, there's so few women and people of minority backgrounds represented in engineering?
I mean, I could spend an hour just talking about this. And I think that's exactly the problem, is that the issues and barriers lie at every single stage of life, of employment and everything. But, I have a daughter, and she, at the moment, she says she wants to be a builder, and I may have something to do with that. But if I want to buy her like a digger outfit, I have to go to the boys section in a shop. So the messages are there from the day she's born, that she would dress a certain way, she would only wear particular motifs or whatever. And these messages keep, filtering through, and that's what we keep hearing our whole lives. It's culture. So if you speak to people from Singapore, from South Korea, Taiwan, girls and boys are never seen as being differentiated in their skills for maths and science. But in the West, in the US and the UK, we have this narrative that's come from somewhere. So it just permeates, kind of every level of society. And even like, if I think back to when I studied physics, I think I had one woman teacher. Every single teacher was white. Most of them were above the age of 70, I think, apart from the one woman who taught us. And we never learned the name of a single woman physicist throughout my degree either. And so even just in the stuff we're studying, that presence really isn't there. So, I mean, yeah, there's just so much work to be done. And people are working on it, but there's still a long way to go.
There's another question I have about responsibility. When reading a book, I was shocked to see that, or to read that, we produce 24 kilograms of electronic waste per person and year in the UK. And probably similar numbers of that exist in other countries, in other developed countries. Now that people have become more conscious of treating our planet with care, different people with different rates, but it's generally been something that's happened in the last few decades. How has engineering responded to that? How much does it change engineering?
Yeah, I think we need to do a lot better. I think engineering has a lot to do. We talk so much about like planned obsolescence. So the fact that either our smartphones or our blenders or tablets or washing machines or whatever the electronic item may be, that they stop working or they don't work as efficiently, or the next new shiny thing comes along and we just get a new one. So it's almost cheaper to replace your washing machine than to repair it nowadays. And so I think that's a big area that we need to be looking at. So shouldn't we be designing more modular things? Like, I know there is one company in Europe somewhere that designs mobile phones where you can change the battery, change the camera, change different components of it to keep it up to date rather than throwing the whole thing away. So I think as consumers, we need to demand more of that. And that was one of the big hopes with my book, is that I hope the next time you see a nail or even a screw, I've got a little screw here as well, that you will now think of them a little bit differently. You have a little bit more of a relationship with these things. And, I started knitting when I was researching my string chapter, and now I'm like obsessed. And if I knit something, I'm never going to get rid of it because I have such a personal connection to that piece of clothes. But if I buy something and it's cheap, then I might just get rid of it. Textile waste is another huge, huge problem. So what I want to try and do is to encourage the listeners, the viewers, to think about how they can change their relationship with the engineering around us and what that means. So that's the takeaway message I would love everyone to have today, is just to be a little bit more curious about the stuff around us and just ask questions like, I wonder when that was first invented, or where did it come from, or how much energy must have been used to produce this thing, and where will it end up once we finish using it? Just ask yourselves all these kinds of questions.
Yeah, I remember you writing about when you're up in the shard, you don't so much look out the window. You look a lot at the nuts and bolts you can see from there.
Yes.
I thought that was very very poignant.
Yeah, sometimes I say that you have you get an engineer's X-ray vision when you're an engineer, because I've worked on that chart, that building for 6 years. So of course I see the big building, I see the shiny glass, I see the big steel and the concrete, I see all of those things. But I also see like the hours spent on looking at the nuts and bolts, the design, we had to arrange them in a particular way so they look great. There's so much thought and design that goes into all of this stuff that I just want people to kind of look at things twice and ask a few questions about it.
Yeah, one more question from me before we get to the audience questions. It's a very, very fuzzy and general one. To you, what is an engineer and what makes a great engineer?
It is an amazing question, but it is a very difficult one to answer. So for me, an engineer is somebody who thinks creatively to solve problems. And then underlying that, so creativity is in my definition. I think responsibility, ethics, morals, all of those things come into it as well. I almost don't even talk about the technical skills because that's almost a given, but it's all these other things, these other skills I think are incredibly important. So for me, as an engineer is somebody who can communicate, who is creative, who can share ideas, who can admit when they're wrong and try and do something in a different way or a better way. And you have to then, also think about what your bigger responsibilities are. So I hope that's at least a starter definition.
That's a great answer. We do have a couple of audience questions, so let's get to those. Matt asks, when you write, do you find that you bring any of your structural engineering expertise to the writing process itself? For example, when considering the structure of your themes, narratives, etc.
I absolutely love this question, Matt, and the answer is yes. So on a kind of practical level, I use spreadsheets for everything. So I use a spreadsheet to plan out my chapters, my themes, what's going to go into them, and so on. And my publishers and even my agent are always like, oh yeah, here's Roma with a spreadsheet. They'd never really seen authors using spreadsheets in the past. I was like, I'm an engineer. Of course, I need some kind of structure or something. And then 100% I use, again, very structured method of putting my books together. So, if you read Nuts and Bolts, you'll realize that each chapter has got 3 parts. Each part is a story. Each part will contain a bit of history, a bit of engineering, a bit of science, a person. And so the texture part of it is also really important to me. So I don't want my readers to be reading tons and tons of really technical stuff and then have tons of historical stuff. Like I want to weave things in really well, maybe a bit like materials come together in a structure. But thank you, that's a really lovely question.
That's a great example for how the engineering mindset can influence completely different sets of things. I think we have another audience question. Clara asks, "Hi Roma, thank you for joining us. What was the most surprising discovery when writing the book?"
Yeah, I love this. And I think that's a really important thing to consider and to remember, is that I'm not an expert in these things. These are things that I am discovering, these objects. I'm on a journey of discovery myself when I'm writing about these things. I'm doing the research, I'm learning about all the stuff. But for me, I think the most surprising discovery are the people. And we've talked about Josephine, Cochran, we've talked about Ibn al-Haytham. I just find the stories of the human beings so utterly fascinating. I've written about a Russian cosmonaut who nearly dies on his first ever spacewalk, the first human spacewalk, and how his suit gets filled with his sweat all the way up to his knees, like his sweat is sloshing around in his suit. And then how, as a result of that, when the Americans started designing spacesuits, they made sure that there was a temperature control system for their astronauts. And I mean, another quick example was John and Mary Gibbon, who invented the heart-lung machine. So that's the bypass machine, which means it takes the blood out, looks after the blood, puts it back into you, and they can do open heart surgery and so on. And they experimented on cats. So they used little cats, stray cats, and they used to experiment on the cats before they were able to test it out on humans. But yet, I mean, there are just kind of endless human stories behind engineering. And I think like I said, we forget those. We just get so caught up in the numbers and the code and all the other stuff that sometimes we forget that there are fascinating humans behind that, particularly fascinating humans that we may not have heard of. And I really love that. That's my favorite part of the writing process.
Thank you so much. I think we are out of questions. If anyone still needs to get more excited about curiosity and engineering, I can really recommend Roma's book. It's a great read. It's a read about engineering, but also as much about engineers and about people. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a lot of success with your book. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jan. It's been a real pleasure.